Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's called The Talbot Spy, an online publication on the Eastern Shore. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. On its front page, you'll find a number of stories. There are those that deal with Maryland's first congressional race and funding for the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Funds. There are others on the environment, which note the impact of rising sea levels. There are also stories on the arts and music. And the online magazine has also initiated a new feature called Senior Nation, as we see the grain of the Eastern Shore. At our studio this morning is Dave Wheelan. He is the executive editor of Talbot Spy. Welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me.
So how did you get into the business of the Talbot Spy, and how was it created?
Well, I've tried to escape the Eastern Shore 3 times in my life. I came here as a college student at Washington College in Chestertown, and then came back as an administrator at Washington College, and then I was in California for 20 years. And basically, I was a professional beggar for nonprofits, including the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Land. And after 30 years, I decided I wanted a second life. I had been working on a project at the University of California at Berkeley that blew up in the recession. And I took 6 months with my severance pay and looked at different nonprofit and profit organizations or models of those that I could bring back to the Eastern Shore. And I went to a small town called Point Reyes Station, California, population 500. And every Wednesday, people would line up for not one, but 2 of the weekly newspapers. And I realized at that point that local news was almost part of our DNA, that we have such a unique curiosity about what is going on in our hood. And at the same time, you had this great crossover with the power of the internet. So I never thought that I could afford to publish a newspaper. But when you saw the convergence of multimedia and the internet coming together, this was in 2008, I thought I could make a run of it. And so I was always curious about how, in particular, Chestertown had somewhat escaped the development that had taken place in other parts of the Eastern Shore. But I thought that they were at risk. And I felt like a local online newspaper would give people the information they needed to make critical choices and decisions. And
so how did you put it together? What kind of finance did you do? What kind of how did that?
You mean what credit card did I take?
Right. Yeah, or what credit card is good?
With Visa, thank you very much. But it was trying to find a role model that I could copy, which was the greatest challenge because it was kind of a new business. There was one online newspaper in Seattle that was somewhat similar to what I wanted to do. But I think the real difference was that I didn't necessarily see this as a journalistic venture. I saw it as an education venture. And I think that there is a distinction there. So I really wanted to focus on public affairs, culture, and the arts. And I came back in 2008 to start this. I was fortunate to have a friend who had worked at AP for 30 years, John Lang, and we kind of pieced together what this would look like. And
what kind of response? What was the immediate response?
Well,
did anybody know you were there, I guess is the question, right?
Well, in a small town, Chestertown is about 5,000 people. Word of mouth actually does travel very quickly. And I think it was very powerful, particularly as we started using multimedia, to listen to what your mayor sounds like, something that no matter how well-meaning your weekly newspaper is, it does not give you that kind of contextual feel for people and their policies. I think people were pleasantly surprised and were very supportive right from the get-go.
How do you contrast what you're doing to, say, a local newspaper?
Well, I think we don't We don't cover crime. We don't cover sports. We don't have classified ads. We don't have legal notices. All the things that you usually want out of a newspaper. But I did feel that there was enough interest in those three other areas: the culture, which is history and local food and agriculture, the arts, which of course is significant, and just the what I would call the hyper-local nature of public affairs, and to actually videotape town council meetings for the first time and edit them. So people didn't have to go and watch 3 hours. They could watch the 5 minutes that were really the most pertinent.
What kind of, by the way, what kind of response have you gotten from the local officials? I mean, how have they reacted to it?
Well, most of the time they've been very supportive, but I think it was a new dynamic where you actually were going to be videotaped, and that was going to show up the next morning. Usually you have 4 or 5 days before. I do admire the Kent County News, but I kept on saying I have 6 days and 23 hours to beat them to a story. And so, it was that kind of instantaneous nature of it as well as anything else.
So what major trends then did you see on the Eastern Shore in your neck of the woods? What are you guys grappling with, you think?
Well, as you may know, the third bridge is coming online, which I think will be a story for several years. But it strikes fear in most people in that county. Mm-hmm. I started the Talbot Spy maybe 2 years later, and they're not as directly impacted by that. They're more worried about workforce housing and economic development. So there's a little bit of a split.
A division there?
Yeah.
Are they fearful that all those people in the Western Shore are going to start flooding in there?
Absolutely.
Is that the deal?
It'll be a Baltimore suburb if they build the bridge, I think most people think. But what's interesting is 5 years ago, that bridge controversy would be hands down, we don't want a bridge. Now there's a group of people in Chestertown that actually see the positive aspects of that. And so the spy's job is to try to give a platform for both points of view. And it's going to be an intriguing debate.
So what do you think that, in terms of, well, you have a number, I mean, you obviously have a number of stories, and including, of course, I mean, obviously we have the first congressional district race. How do you size that up? And you had a debate of your own, I think, not too long ago with at least a number of the Democratic candidates.
Yeah, well, we've been doing introductory interviews with the Democratic candidates. We're going to catch up with who might be opposite Andy Harris this year, but we haven't done that yet. But it's amazing to me. When I started the Spy, it was really not a particularly strong showing on the Democratic side, and I think that now we have 4 viable candidates that are running, and it might be one of these congressional districts that flips. We don't know yet, but I think that there's a lot of collateral damage with Congressman Harris and the current president.
I mean, even though this district is a conservative district and was designed for that purpose.
Well, it is now, but as you may know, the Eastern Shore has had a record of what I would call moderate Democrats and Republicans, going all the way back to Rogers Morton.
Right.
And so this may be much more of a Western Shore issue, but I think that I think the door is open, at least on the Eastern Shore, for a moderate Democrat, just as we saw in Pennsylvania in the 18th district there. A veteran comes out of nowhere and does very well. We have a fellow by the name of Jesse Covell, who's running, who's been, I think, in Afghanistan with 4 tours of duty. He's an Army Ranger. That adds a component that we hadn't seen before. So we'll have to watch.
It should mention, by the way, he's also raised a lot of money.
He has,
which is really striking for a seat like this.
Right. It's actually becoming competitive. And I think the spy saw this several months ago. I think that there was just an ongoing desire to make a viable race out of this.
But we need to ask you about the Talbot boys, the statue.
Yes.
You covered that. We've had in Salisbury. We've had a sort of our own little thing about a plaque for a General Winder who was actually oversaw the prisons of the Confederacy.
Oh,
So that has generated its own interesting debate. But give me some sense about how people feel about that statue, and why is it still there, or why hasn't something else, do you think, either come to replace it or complement it?
well, it's interesting the timing because as Charlottesville took place, Easton and Talbot County had been there, done that. This was 2 years before this took place, and it was a fascinating thing to cover because, again, as you go back to our goal, which is educational, there's a huge amount of history that has to be to fill in the blanks when you talk about something like that. And so there was probably more. This was not, General Lee on a horse. This was the Talbot boys. And even though this had been, created by the Confederate, the widows of Confederate soldiers or something like that, these were kids who showed up. That's all they did. Somebody else decided to have a war. But 80 to 90% of the kids that are on that plaque were just farm people. They didn't own slaves. They really didn't have a dog in that fight. But they showed up. And I think that made kind of a significant difference in how people viewed that. The other side of the story is that the women's Confederate group did their project, but the invitation had gone out to Union soldiers groups to resurrect their statue. They didn't come up with enough money, so but it brought into focus, as it should, issues like race, history, and the unique, almost schizophrenic role that the Eastern Shore had in relationship to slavery, where I had a historian, I think he's in Salisbury, I'm sure you've interviewed him, I'm pausing on his name, but he had tracked, for example, the local newspapers during that time. And invariably, you would find one newspaper editorial saying, we oppose slavery, but we do not want to succeed from the Union, and vice versa. People that were for slavery, but it was one of that kind of twisting things that. And in Talbot County, it was, I think, 50% free black citizens by the time the war took place. So when you put all this together, and I think it was so useful because I think most people had either forgotten about this history or they actually, didn't know about it, to bring it to the forefront when you had that discussion. The county council decided after a year to keep the statue. The Spy has done an editorial pleading for signage related to that statue. It's one thing to have a statue up, but if you don't tell people what that backstory is at this point, it really is disappointing. So I don't think that the issue is really going to go away for a while, but it was an interesting jolt after the county had had such great success with its Frederick Douglass statue and that kind of thing.
Do you think that the county will ever move to have some kind of additional statue? I know it was one of the suggestions made. That, and I understand that even the establishment of the Frederick Douglass edifices were, even that was controversial at the time. Yeah. So, do you think that the county, or do you think the county's just in a sort of stay as you are mode for the moment until something maybe down the road, and they might then do something?
Well, the NAACP obviously
Right.
has been very involved in it, and I don't believe that they're going to ever give up on that issue. The problem with the second statue for Union soldiers is purely the expense. These things can run. I think Frederick Douglass was like $60,000 to $100,000 in total. So it's not just the political might, but it's the financial that probably will make that not possible for some time. But I do believe that we will get to a point where we'll be much better at interpreting these sites and these monuments over the next 10 or 15 years, especially with the use of technology, where you can hold up a phone and you can get that story. But I think it would have been a totally different thing if we had really been honoring a Confederate general or the president of the Confederacy.
Has it finally, in all good science, has this divided the community, you think? I mean, in a sense, more visibly, perhaps, than perhaps it has in the past? I mean, because it does tend to bring to the surface a lot of feelings that perhaps were not publicly expressed or were running underground.
Yeah, it certainly was a very unpleasant experience, I think, for everyone. And I do feel like that the race relations in Talbot County are improving in general. This set it back. But, I think what was interesting as I watched this debate was how often those who didn't live in the county came to the county to protest either for or against the statue. And I think that that's where some of the most toxic language came from, was from these outside groups. That I think when you look at the videotapes of these open forums, it was inevitably the outsider, maybe the representative of the Confederate Veterans Association from Virginia, comes up and makes some pretty wild claims about things. So, I would say that in general we've gotten over, at least in the time being. I still, as I say, the issue is going to continue to be something that has to be resolved.
By the way, in looking at your site, you on the op-ed page, as it were, you have a lot of debate about guns, and a number of, there are a number of, letters or whatever supporting some kind of regulation or more regulation. How do you read that issue? I mean, obviously, and how did you decide to select the letters that you decided to publish?
Well, we usually will put up anything that people send us that if it's constructive and well written, since we don't have the physical limitations of a newspaper. But I think it is fascinating to see the county politically shift. I think that, again, even some of the more conservative gun owners in the area see common sense gun laws as a way forward. I don't know if that was an issue 10 years ago. We did see many students take part in last week's protest. It will be interesting what happens on the 24th. But I think that it mirrors, a shift in the country. Where this kind of laissez-faire approach to gun ownership is now being looked at. So we'll see.
But now you have a new feature, but it's actually been around for a little while, which is the Senior Nation. Tell me a little bit about the thinking behind that, since we're all going to get there one way or the other, I guess.
Well, it's kind of funny because when I started looking at the readership of the Spy, both Spies. When I started it, it's an internet site. I'll have the millenniums. I'll have the young people looking at this. Well, no, it turns out that I did a Google Analytics research project and found that 70% of our readers are over 60 years old. And again, it just reflects the community that we live in. And so at the end of the day, I realized the whole newspaper was kind of a senior publication, given our readership. But I also am moving into that demographic, and I'm interested for the first time in these issues. And in fact, today I'm running an interview with Gary Gunther, who's the Upper Shore Aging Director, who's been there for 30 years. And as you probably know, services are declining. In a culture that we want to continue to age in place, is the phrase, the services that help that have not been institutionalized to the point where we can really see that as a viable solution for many people. And the government and society actually improves so much when you can not institutionalize the elderly or pushing them into nursing homes before their time. Everybody wins. So it's been interesting to see that, and also on the other side of the scale, the emergence of a relatively affluent retirement community, particularly in Talbot County, that are playing such a critical role in not only politics, but in education and all the nonprofit support that they provide. So I think it's a blessing, but it always has been, from my point of view, not as covered as well as it should. And it's not just these extremes of, retirement communities versus nursing homes, but it's also how people use these years of their life. What are the volunteer aspects of it? What are the intellectual aspects of it? And we have had tremendous luck in having either columnists or writers talk about this, either using prose or poetry or different points of view. So it's been great. And I think very responsive to what the community is all about.
In covering this particular community, is there one overriding need, do you think, that you see that kind of ties in a lot of the other sort of dimensions? I mean, is there a single need, broadly speaking?
Well, clearly I think affordable housing, senior housing is on the front burner. There are so many other issues like health care and nutrition. Upper Shore Aging does a lot with Meals on Wheels. Their budgets, they consider it a success if it's the same funding they got last year.
Right.
But the people that need that service has grown. So they're always playing catch up. And I suspect that's the case in Kent County as well, that we just simply have an overwhelming number of people that need special services. So I think it's the whole package.
So is from your sense, is most of this then falling into the hands of the nonprofit sector, the private sector, as opposed to government, local government in particular?
Yeah, and I think that, going back to Gary Gunther's interview, I think he was, as we all are, been surprised that even though there is such a political powerhouse with those over 60, and that's growing literally every year, that hasn't manifested itself into policies that redirect funding to these needs. So it's a little peculiar that, we just haven't made better strides here.
So in terms of the environment and that sort of thing, are people as concerned? I mean, you've got I guess it's the National Wildlife Refuge there and so on. What do people make of that, and particularly to watch the land literally disappear? I mean, we have not only the sea level rise, but also obviously there's also a descending landmass as well. How are people coping with that? I mean, I was out there, I think, a few years earlier, and you could see where of course, a lot of the homes are now like 8 feet off the ground before they even start the ground floor. Others you can see where the water's going to wash around them, and you can't figure out how they're going to get out of their house. What do you make of how's the county, how's that region dealing with that disappearing landmass?
Well, part of it is the educational learning curve. And so I don't know if you're aware of this great documentary of Dorchester County being underwater and, within the next 20 years or so.
Right.
And I think that shocks everybody. I mean, we think of it in very abstract terms until Tom Horton has been kind of the leading charge on this. And, he goes back to the place where he used to play baseball, and the water's up to his kneecaps. So, it's very real now, and I think we're just at the beginning of realizing what we have to do to preserve what we have now. And so it's how that turns out politically, it's too early to tell, but I think we're at the first stages of real general awareness of the problem.
Do you see do you see changes within, say, building codes that are going to come along, or is there going to be a retrenchment, say, strategy as the water moves through the land?
Yeah, again, it's kind of hard to say. I also feel like, once again, technology is going to be key to this. And I think we're looking at a lot of different solutions right now, but there's not one main one other than to control growth and to, be much more cognizant of planning decisions at this point. It's hard to say.
And what about the development around, cities like Easton and so on? Is that being better planned, do you think?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Okay.
But
Of course.
as the case may be, I think that both Kent County and Talbot County are extremely conscientious of how unique their landscapes are, and there is a very dedicated group of people who want no growth. There's counterbalanced by people who want reasonable economic development. What's interesting about Easton is that it has become a regional shopping center, and that people are coming from Kent County, Caroline County, Dorchester County to go see their doctor, to go shopping at a store and have lunch and then go back. And I think that Easton's trying to figure out how to manage that growth. I think the other issue, as I said before, is workforce housing, that you cannot have this growth without the people that can staff those stores and those amenities, and that's very, very rare. Which leads some people to want to have, for example, a third bridge where you have this infusion of growth that you normally wouldn't have. So it's hard to say right now.
The other element, and I actually covered this a little a few years ago, was immigration and the increasing number of Hispanic children, particularly immigrant children. I know I talked to some of the folks at some of the schools out there a number of years ago, talking about how they saw a serious increase in the number of immigrant children in particular. They've had to make some adjustments. How's the region adjusting to that kind of influx that we're seeing? Because they certainly were, when I talked to them, they were struggling with trying to figure out how to handle it, because obviously you have not only language issues, but also then the cultural issues as well, and the relationships between various groups of people.
It's probably very similar to what Salisbury's doing, where it's a real adjustment. I think in the public schools, I think there are over 40 languages that make up the student body, and I have to say that, generally speaking, I'm very impressed with the response. We have a terrific multicultural center that's doing a phenomenal job, not only in servicing this particular group of people, but in educating the community in general. So when you have hyperbolic statements coming from Washington, to have that absorbed locally and to still have that great commitment to making those families feel safe and secure and have those kids well educated is, I think, the overwhelming majority of the people that live in those communities.
I mean, is there any kind of adjustment by the white community or the Native American, the folks who have grown up here, African American community, in terms of this growing community? I mean, how are they making the adjustment?
Say again, I'm sorry.
So how do you think that the community is making its adjustment to this particular growing population?
Oh, I think that they, again, these are gross overstatement generalizations, but I think that they're excited by it. I think that they are aware that these are kids that are becoming Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and are playing roles in schools, and their parents are, the perfect example of the American dream. So I think that there's a great deal of support in the abstract. I still think that we have a long way to go in terms of making sure that services are available to them. To, just a simple thing of getting a drug prescription filled if you don't speak English Right. It's a problem, and we found that. And we did an article maybe 4 years ago where we realized that of the pharmacies in Easton, only 1 out of 5 were really able to do bilingual, transaction. If you go into, let's say, Walmart or whatever, they will get you on a phone but that could take an hour. You really have to plan to that up, and so those are the kind of the small things that add up that make it more welcoming. But I think I think that the learning curve is really, really high in Easton in terms of how important these communities are. In Kent County, I would say that most of those populations are outside of the major towns that we have, major in quote. They're working on farms that are some distance out of town, so they're less visible.
So, and finally, you have a number of columnists. People write essays. We have one of them, George Merrill, of course, who I guess you made a star.
Yes,
or somebody's made
we've made a couple of rock stars.
I think we've contributed to George's late career, as it were. Any favorites, columnists you have?
Well,
any
they're all.
columns? I mean, I know you
great.
love them all, right?
We're all having lunch on Friday, and there's 6 of them. And I am such a lucky guy to have those people helping with the spy. Every one of them, from Howard Freelander, who was the assistant treasurer of the state, to Al Sykes, who was former chair of the FCC, to Craig Fuller, who was George Bush's chief of staff, to George Merrill. I mean, we've just got a first-class group of people who care about their community, and they don't care. They care sometimes how much they get paid, but not too often. And they embrace the idea of what the spy's trying to do. It's interesting, the Legacy newspaper, which I'm also fond of, the Star Democrat, that most of their op-ed pieces come from national columnists. There's very little local commentary. There's letters to the editor, but in terms of weekly columns, it's all George Will and these other guys. So I'm very, very lucky. And the irony is, I would say that I'm a moderate politically. I would say 5 out of the 6 of our columnists are Republicans.
Oh, that's interesting.
And very thoughtful ones at that.
One would hope.
One would hope. No, they are. They're this.
Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, and David Montgomery, who's was an academic who proved the theory of cap and trade, and actually was instrumental in the formation of cap and trade in California, which did a tremendous amount of good for that, especially with air pollution. But he's our only Trumpian left. I was kind of getting depressed because all of our Republicans had kind of lost enthusiasm for their leader of their party.
How do you find the community reaction to the current president? Because as you say, there's even a division within the Republican ranks.
Well, going back to my earlier statement, I think it's interesting that especially in Talbot County, there's a history of what I would call moderate republicanism, and I think that they're kind of lost at sea. They don't know what that party means anymore. And it's not like they're going to run over to the Democratic side, but I think that this has given them pause, and they hope that. I'm generalizing, but I think that they hope that this is a very short-term bump in the road, and they can get back to fully embracing the Republican mission. But right now, it's a problem, and this is what makes the first district, I think, a possible flip district for the Democrats because of that frustration.
We're speaking with Dave Wheelan. He is the executive editor of the Talbot Spy. We appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us this morning.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.